A nation's primary access to resources is its own. Resources are also the primary struggle of a nation and a main spark of war and conquest. Endless wars of attrition have been fought where most often the benefit is to those who bow before greed and cripple those that stand for freedom. For war to happen, it originally meant the people had to fund them through war bonds. It was a basic understanding that if a nation's resources and people were being spent on war, the reward for success had to outweigh the despair it would cause, not only their own people, but those of the other nations caught in the crossfire. With the elimination of war bonds through the adoption of central banks and fractionalized banking, it allowed nations to launch endless wars despite the objection of its own people and irresponsibly spend money that they did not have. This has resulted in a debt that is impossible to balance or overcome. Any nation's goal is to utilize the resources it has to produce a greater value than it began with, which in turn allows for the expansion and allocation of more resources. America is not a nation short of resources, but when you have an economy that serves the consumer first and the citizen second, it becomes about profit margins and resource privatization rather than security and distribution. Since we have a global economy, our own people are treated as foreign citizens within our own borders because we are a number in a bank account on a screen. Corporations outsource jobs overseas to cut costs, cause environmental calamity to meet the demands they marketed for, and want the benefits of every system while not being beholden to one. Accountability and regulation is necessary in that aspect to restrict their rights if they violate ours. The goal should not be to create debt in the assumption of production, nor to conquer with aspirations to secure and monopolize. The goal should always be to produce maximum potential with minimum restriction on an individual basis. Provide the resources and you produce the products. Where you lack the resources, you rely on trade and mutual agreements of exchange to compensate. In terms of resource security and ownership, I will be brief because I feel John Locke in his Second Treatise of Government does an exceptional job at the explanation and justification behind ownership. I will rather simply give a brief highlight of the key concept. God may have given the earth to all, but competition is inevitable and scarcity is possible, given a progression of time and uncertainty of circumstance. So rights need to be established for ownership of resources and the rights of property for production, distribution, and maintenance. How then do we distinguish who has the right to what if the earth is given to all of us? John Locke argues that ownership is established when labor is put into a common commodity with no established owner. Ownership can be only maintained with responsibility. If a man cannot maintain his whole field, nor is in need of his whole seed, he has no right to sole ownership nor his whole harvest. If production and consumption destroys others' resources and ecosystems or rights, they lose their own right to operate and provide. That is why government is also necessary, to ensure that all abide by the will and not by their own gluttony and greed. Government must be responsible for regulating and ensuring equal access to domestic resources already at their disposal, but also providing the proper resources for its people to grow where they lack. People need resources in order to produce, maintain, and recreate to sustain life. Otherwise, you risk dehydration, starvation, and annihilation. The ability to produce is determined by circumstances in combination with opportunity and driven by desire. In order to maintain a state of existence, you need proper access, adequate storage, and guaranteed security of resources. Recreation implies you have a state of living you would like to reproduce, which is achieved through secured independence and quality of life. The issue arises on account that different climates are better suited to produce different crops. Therefore, individuals hardly have the means of equal access on their own. It is also no stretch to imagine that individuals are better suited for different roles based on their individual strengths while having different drives and motivations based on preference and experience. So, how do you synchronize an inequality of distribution with uncertainty of personal need and motivation while guaranteeing certainty of opportunity and maximum production capability without violating individual or environmental rights? Seems an impossible question. I would suggest that it may be wise then to incentivize individuals to become self-producers according to their own needs by providing access to education and assistance in acquisition of land and resources. This naturally increases the capability of the host's ability to produce and distribute the excess of resources and products equally, and in the interest of growth and security for all individuals. Sadly, we typically resort to conquest rather than cooperation, because imposing your will is easier and more convenient than changing someone else's, let alone yours. Competition trumps cooperation when opportunity meets insecurity and is embellished by greed and vanity. Competition automatically assumes a form of oppression, whether to secure or to defend. The competition for resources is the oldest form of oppression in history, and humans were the original resource. Not our labor and ability to work like with slavery, not even our intellect and ability to think like with capitalism. The human soul is the source subject of oppression, wanting to control the soul rather than free it, dictating the actions of others or showing them the alternatives, loving yourself or loving God. There is a war for humanity's soul between God and Satan, and has resulted in endless battles, physical and spiritual. Satan oppresses man's soul. Christ frees him. So let's examine our current society briefly in terms of competition and oppression and see if we can finally end that war forever.